So our relationship, the United States relationship with Mexico, of course, goes all the way back till since Mexico got its independence in 1822. That was the year after Spain gave Florida to the United States. Mexico got its independence, so you can see Spain was in trouble about that. We signed a treaty with the new Mexican nation in 1828, I think, which set the boundaries of Mexico. You know the boundaries of Mexico today. The boundaries of Mexico then included California and Texas and parts of Utah and Colorado and and parts of Nevada and and New Mexico and Arizona. I mean, a big chunk on it. And that was 1828 when we signed that treaty, and then about less than 10 years later, Texas decided it had to get out of Mexico and had a revolution. Mexico never recognized Texas as having escaped from Mexico, but in 1845, Texas became a state in the United States. So that chunk is gone. And then between 1846 and 1848, of course, we fought a war with Mexico, the Mexican War. Some people say it was the dress rehearsal for the Civil War. We fought a 2-year war during which we took all that land that I just talked about. So Mexico was reduced in half by 1848. This a little extra piece came after that. This was very easy for us to take. We had the vision of the United States from sea to shining sea, right? Manifest destiny. But the people of Mexico found it a little more difficult to accept all of that. And I think you could say that our relations with Mexico didn't start off on a real cheerful foot for them anyway. So that takes you through about 10 pages of my thing, all those nice maps you're not going to get to see. It's really sad. Anyway, Mexico went through, the 19th century in Mexico was very difficult because she went through invasions by Spain and France during that period. And we probably would have interfered when France set up an empire in Mexico, but we were in the middle of our Civil War, and so we didn't. At the end of that period, Mexico was left with a dictatorship which was overthrown during the period that's called the Mexican Revolution, which ends about 1924. So it's a long struggle, and twice during the period of the Mexican Revolution, we sent troops down there, mainly about American investments in Mexico, and about border skirmishes in Mexico. Anyway, at the end of this period of revolution, Mexico did form what we would call a constitutional government, a constitutional democratic government. But during that period of struggle and revolution and a great deal of violence, by the 1920s, more than 900,000 Mexicans had come to the United States to live. There was, of course, no quota that barred Mexicans. Even after we had the quota system, people in the Western Hemisphere were free to come at any time. That doesn't mean they were accepted with open arms, but there was no quota system that involved Mexico. The first backlash against Mexican immigration that we can really document came between 1929 and 1936. That was the period of the Depression, of course, when we didn't need extra labor around here. So when jobs became scarce, the United States government instituted what was known as the repatriation, a mass deportation of Mexicans and Mexican Americans from the United States. Somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million, there's many different numbers for this. But some scholars say of the Mexicans who were sent back, 60% were actually American citizens. people of Mexican descent were simply rounded off, put in trucks, and taken to the border and let off during that time. Well, anyway, we invited them back during the war because, of course, we needed labor then. So we invited them back during the war. But in the 50s, we went through another time of concern about immigration, and we repeated the repatriation with something that was called Operation Wetback in the mid-50s. It's been a real love-hate relationship from the beginning with Mexico, I would say. In any case, General Alvaro Obregón, I hope none of you are Spanish speakers, a liberal reformer, had become president as the Mexican Revolution came to a close in the 20s. And his government was finally recognized by the United States in 1923. It was a difficult period when the Mexican government asked for recognition by the United States because they were threatening to nationalize American oil companies in Mexico. Obregón did not, and he negotiated with the Americans, and we did recognize the Mexican government at that point. But of course, 15 years later, under the leadership of President Lázaro Cárdenas, gas and oil were nationalized in Mexico. Pemex, you may have heard of, a large Mexican oil company. For a short time, the United States and the UK and Dutch oil companies boycotted, and the Netherlands boycotted the United States, but then World War II started and Mexico came in on our side this time, although in World War I they had been neutral. In World War II, Mexico came in on the Allied side, and so compensation problems with the oil companies were resolved. Pemex became one of the world's largest oil companies, and it was the basis for economic stability in Mexico for a long time, in the 40s and the 50s. Then in 1976, there was a huge oil reserve was discovered in the Gulf of Mexico, and it was a boon. You know, it was going to make such a difference in Mexico. The president promised to use the oil money for industrial expansion and high-yield agriculture and social welfare projects. Then it was discovered that the oil was generally of low grade, and at the same time there was a glut of oil on the world market. So Mexico was left with the world's largest foreign debt. By the 1980s, Mexico was in financial crisis. One of the slides I wish I had is just a list of Mexican presidents. And I have them in blue and red and purple. And there are, well, I don't know, from 1924 to 2000, for 70 years, those names are all blue on my scheme that I wanted to show you. And that's because they're all the same party. They're all PRI. For 70 years, Mexico was led by the same party, the PRI, or the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. They ruled uninterrupted for 70 years. The PRI had several different faces, adopted various ideologies over the years, but since the 1980s, it has adopted center-right politics, such as the privatization of state-run companies, which it was originally opposed to, and close relations with the Catholic Church and free market capitalism. But whatever its policies, by the end of the 20th century, the PRI had a reputation for corruption, electoral fraud, and authoritarianism. My son teaches this stuff, and I called him and said, what should I say? He said, what should I say about the PRI? He said, it's the perfect party. It was the perfect party dictatorship. Presidents were elected every 6 years. Then elite leaders in the PRI appointed their own successors who, with nominal opposition, won automatically at the polls. when the PAN, the PAN, or Center-Right Party, won the presidency in 2000 with the election of Vicente Fox, he was the first PRI president since 1928. The PAN is a right party. And then the PRI regained the presidency once from 2012 to 2018. Peña Nieto, you'll probably remember his name. But corruption scandals and the government's inability to curb the crime rate really led to the PRI losing the presidency again in 2018. Polls taken at about the time of that election showed that most Mexicans saw their government as deeply corrupt and totally ineffective against the ballooning crime wave. And it is unbelievable. The PRI for many years made deals with the cartels in Mexico in exchange for peace. And there was a rising tide of murder and kidnapping and violence, and just showed that this approach was not working. Well, in 2018, we had the election of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, from a left-wing party that is nicknamed Moreno. And Obrador is generally called AMLO, which is his initials, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. He put together a coalition government when he won, but his victory was overwhelming. Many local governorships, state governorships, were won by the same party. It was his third run for the presidency, and he started out in the PRI like everybody else in Mexican politics. But it was really the worst. This was the worst political defeat for the PRI ever, and one wonders if they'll ever be able to get back. There's not much about Lopez Obrador. He's a really good-looking man, big, handsome sort of guy, shock of white hair, And he is. I have been reading. The Washington Post had a series of articles about what's going on in Mexico about a month ago. And there's a great deal of concern about what is happening because Lopez Obrador has had such overwhelming success at the polls that he feels very close to the people and they to him, because every day he's on television communicating with, every morning he's on TV communicating with the people. He has abolished several bureaucratic organizations which used to broker between the people and the government. And his leadership in many of the state governments, as I said. People are worried about authoritarianism and demagoguery in Mexico. He is a populist. So we just kind of have to wait and see, what happens. But I don't think it's all rosy. As far as the government of Mexico is concerned now. So maybe some of you all know more about AMLO than I do, and you can help with that afterwards. So we're going to see a film, and it's a Great Decisions film. How many of you know what Great Decisions is? Have you ever heard of Great Decisions? Good. Well, I'm glad, because generally they are of high quality. But as I said, the film we're going to see is a year old, and so it doesn't have much about AMLO or the recent problems that have been so much in the paper. The three core issues that are discussed in this film: immigration, trade, and security cooperation. This is a film about U.S.-Mexico and our relationship with Mexico. So those obviously are three major issues of today. The first is immigration. My slide about immigration has a big picture of women and children standing in front of a Border Patrol agent. That's not what we used to think of as immigration, but that's the face of immigration at the southern border today, I think. There's supposed to be young Mexican men looking for agricultural jobs, right? That's not what's there now. there's been a major shift in who is apprehended at the border today, with non-Mexicans far outnumbering Mexicans. Non-Mexicans account for about 80% of the people who come to our southern border, and the people who are apprehended by the Border Patrol. Most of those people, not all of them, they come from all over the world. It's real interesting. I read an article that Human Rights Watch had an article recently, a paper that they put out, in which they talked about the nationalities. There were Ugandans, a lot of Cubans, people from other places in Africa who come to Mexico to come to the United States, which surprised me. But most of these people, most of them are from what we call the Northern Triangle nations: Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And you all know that from reading just a little bit of the newspaper these days. Fiscal 2019, apprehensions, that is people who were apprehended and sent home at the U.S.-Mexico border, more than doubled between fiscal 2018 and 2019. But it's interesting that those numbers remained below historical highs. I wish I could read this thing here, which I brought, but I can barely read it. It's bad. About 2000 is the high, the highest point around 2000. And it's gone down since then, but gone up about a quarter of the way in 2019. And people traveling in families account for the majority of the apprehensions. You know what can happen to people who come to the border, right? There are two things that can happen to them. They can be removed, that is, sent home or taken home. A lot of them were taken home, taken back to Mexico and dropped off, a lot of them. But they could also become eligible for asylum if officials determine that they meet the definition of a refugee. Asylum applications have increased substantially in recent years, but the acceptance rate has remained very steady. It's not gone up much. There was a drop there's a drop from September in 2019 to now. There's been a drop in apprehensions at the border. It should be noted that despite discourteous rhetoric about Mexico and Mexicans by American leaders and the lack of a coherent U.S. Immigration policy, the cooperation between U.S. and Mexican governments on the ground at the working day-to-day level is, pretty steady. It keeps going on despite what's going on up here in Washington and Mexico City. Recently, there's been cooperation in something that AMLO agreed to, which is called the Migrant Protection Program, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. The other name for that is Remain in Mexico, which sends asylum seekers back to Mexico to await their U.S. hearings. And both governments have voiced also a new joint commitment to address the root causes of immigration in Central America. There's a long article in the New Yorker, there was a long article last fall in the New Yorker called How the U.S. Asylum System is Keeping Migrants at Risk in Mexico. So what happens to people is most of them never get into the United States. They just get sent to these camps along the border or holding places along the border. People who have seen the camps holding asylum seekers on the Mexican side of the border send troubling reports about this program. These vulnerable people are living in shaky, overcrowded settlements in a very dangerous area near the border. According to an analysis by Human Rights First, By October 1st, 2019, there had already been 343 reported cases involving rape, kidnapping, and violent assault of asylum seekers in the MPP program. Also, the MPP was conceived not as a way to streamline or improve the asylum process, but as a way to keep asylum seekers from entering the United States. People wait months and months just to get a hearing, and usually their first hearing may be 6 months from now, and then they're told to come back in 3 months or 5 months. It's very difficult, a very difficult process. So very few asylum seekers, as I said before, are admitted. Migrant rights advocates estimate that to date about, quote, a dozen people have been granted asylum under MPP. The government has filed appeals in almost all of those cases. Another quote, in September, the Department of Homeland Security opened 2 tent courts along the border in Laredo and Brownsville, where as many as 400 asylum seekers in MPP can be processed each day. People who show up at ports of entry for their hearings will be sent directly to these makeshift courts, rather than to brick-and-mortar courthouses in the U.S. In other words, asylum seekers never set a foot in the United States. It's an interesting program. Okay, the second thing you're going to hear about, and all of that is not in the film because it was written before MPP was made before MPP was started. The second thing is trade, and you will see a lot about trade. Of course, we're talking about the change from NAFTA to the USMCA, the new trade agreement that actually this week was finally ratified by our Congress. It was ratified almost immediately by Mexico. It's kind of interesting. The first NAFTA, Mexico was very reluctant to join the first NAFTA. They did not trust the United States and did not want to have part of it. However, it's turned out well for Mexican business. And so they were the first, they immediately ratified this new. It's not much, it's still a huge free trade area. There are some changes, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I hope you will see some of that on the film. It took some people in the United States Congress that objected to labor provisions and other stuff. Those things were changed, and now it has finally been approved, and afterwards we can talk about it if we don't see enough on the film. The third thing is the thing you've heard most about lately on the news, security, meaning what to do about drugs and guns and international crime and violence. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you must not have been anywhere near a television set in the last few months. I have a map that you should be looking at right now that show territories for the cartels, which is interesting. But it changes all the time. That map changes all the time. The cartels are not necessarily united, and fighting between competing branches is constant. For the last 2 decades, the Mexican government has joined with American law enforcement to try to cut off the leadership of the cartels. El Chapo. Okay. And there are probably a lot more groups than we even know about. Mexican presidents declared war on drug lords and transferred responsibility for the war to the Mexican Army and US DEA and other agents. The result has not been a dissolution of the cartels, but in many instances just a division of the cartels into competing units, which has meant more violence. The next map I was going to show you is a map of where the drugs come from. And one arrow comes from China, and one comes from Colombia, one comes from Venezuela. In other words, Mexico does pretty well growing poppies for heroin and stuff, and growing marijuana. And in fact, they do import the basic ingredients of methamphetamines, but they really are brokers as well as, it's not just bringing stuff that it's from all over the world. It comes to Mexico and then comes to the United States. Okay, And what that map doesn't show is how international it really is. I mean, the drug cartels are huge international corporations. They are not little Mexican gangs. They're huge, and they have money being laundered in banks all over the world. Have offices in cities all over the world. I mean, they're huge. And then there's a map I was going to show you that shows where the cartels, you know, the Sinaloa cartel mainly hits southeastern United States and, you know, eastern United States, and another cartel has the divvies on Chicago and another one on Los Angeles. They kind of have business all over the country. According to some sources, what drives this trade is U.S. demand. You know, and according to some sources, the United States is the largest drug consumer in the world. So how do we contribute to this trade? Well, we send guns. Guns are the United States' contribution to the illegal U.S.-Mexican trade. There's just one place you can buy machine guns or any kind of semi-automatic weapons in Mexico, and it's owned by the military. Semi-automatic guns are illegal in Mexico, and 70 to 80% of guns seized by police there can be traced to the United States. Now, there are other places guns have come from too, like the drug wars in Colombia have contributed a lot of guns and other stuff, but most of them come to the United States. That idea that we send the guns, they send the drugs, you know, maybe points to a way that we might help Mexico. If we had the will, maybe we could work on decreasing American demand for drugs and consumption of drugs and stopping the traffic in weapons purchased illegally or at gun shows in the United States. A couple of months ago, there was a real good little opinion piece about that in the Pensacola paper. I think I've got it if you know to see. Anyway, okay, the next few slides are about the cartels and the violence in Mexico, and it is unbelievable. Since the election of Lopez Obrador, the killings between gangs have not subsided. When he took office last December, he promised to end the policy of drug war through a new policy of hugs, not bullets. In other words, finding jobs for these young men so they won't drive, you know, and better education so they won't join the cartels, etc. There are a lot of viewpoints about that. Most of them say, well, good idea, but it doesn't work. And, you know, the next slide was a slide that had a picture of El Chapo being, I think that's in the film too. But the third way the United States may have contributed to the mayhem in Mexico is through the government strategies. During the Obama administration, the Fast and Furious project was started by the Justice Department in an effort to trace the purchase and sale of guns. During the surveillance period, during the period when we were trying to trace where guns went, guns continued to enter Mexico, and the murders in Mexico accelerated a great deal. So Obama ended this plan after criticism from both sides of the border. A second strategy that seems to me hasn't worked has been the Kingpin project I mentioned already, that is chopping off the heads of the leadership of the cartels. Besides El Chapo, several other drug lords have been arrested, especially during the presidency of Peña Nieto. The problem with this strategy is that the cartels haven't disappeared but multiplied. Now El Chapo's sons, by the way, are taking over. Do you all remember seeing in the paper recently a picture of his son, what's his name? Ovidio, who was captured by police, and the Sinaloa cartel came in with and there was a war in this town where he was caught. There was an absolute war. In fact, many cartel members were let out of jail, and there were something like 700 cartel soldiers entered the town of, somebody else help me, I can't remember, but anyway, entered this town, stopped traffic by putting trucks there were people with machine guns on the back of trucks. Several people were killed. 8 people were killed. And finally, AMLO decided the better part of valor was to let this guy go. And he was let go. That is a more complicated story than that sounds, because the reason he was captured by the police was because a judge in New York issued what do you call it?
A warrant.
A warrant, thank you, a warrant for his arrest. So it started in New York, and it ended with people killed, and half the town burned up. I mean, it was just terrible. So has Sinaloa weakened by the capture of El Chapo? I don't know. And then of course, about a month ago, was it, that the Mormon families were killed? 3 women and 6 children were killed on a caravan through Mexico. We don't really know why. We really don't know still why they were killed, why the vehicles were burned. So there were 33,341 homicides in Mexico in 2018. And I had a slide that shows that there were 21,415 killed in Afghanistan since the beginning of that war. So it's, it's a huge number. So on that unhappy note, let's watch the film and see what we can find out.
I shouldn't have those things on top of it.
The U.S. relationship with Mexico has been in the spotlight in recent months because of the politically charged issue of immigration, along with strong rhetoric from the Trump administration.
The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. Most illegal immigrants are lower-skilled workers with less education who compete directly against vulnerable American workers.
As neighbors, however, the two nations have a shared interest in stopping cross-border crime while keeping the doors open to trade. Issues that have helped shape discussions as both sides revisit their trading relationship. A tested relationship, the U.S. and Mexico. Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
It was a defining moment in recent U.S.-Mexico relations when, early in his campaign, then-candidate Donald Trump accused Mexico of sending the worst elements of its society across the border into the United States.
They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Is the concern with border security resonated because this is something the Republican electorate has wanted to see from their elected officials for a long time? It's something that other Republicans say they run on, but they say that we're going to do something about this. We're going to fix a broken immigration system. We're going to get control of the border. We're going to have border security, and they never do anything about it. What happened in candidate Trump's case at the time was a section of the Republican base felt like this was a candidate who actually meant it for once.
People have always wanted somebody to blame. I think that's true. You can go back to, the Germans, the Polish, you can go back to the Italians. There's always a tendency to want to blame people for something. And immigrants have been an easy target.
The accusations that Mexicans were rapists or were murderers, and that Mexico, quote, wasn't sending its best people was not only factually completely wrong, but also generated a kind of image as if Mexico was a person that sent things and not a country that's actually inhabited by people who make decisions.
President Trump has pledged that a wall be constructed on the U.S.-Mexico border, which Mexico will pay for.
We will build a great wall along the southern border.
All Mexicans were pretty much insulted with the idea. It's not, I don't think that we don't understand the importance of having secure borders. I think that it's in the interest of any two countries to have secure borders. But the way that this has been presented for Mexicans was very disrespectful.
I don't know why a wall wouldn't be a viable option. Humanity has known how to build walls for years.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist or to even be Kissinger to figure out why, of all the countries around the world, favorable perceptions of the United States have dropped the most in Mexico.
Immigration is as much a political as a practical challenge for both countries.
We don't necessarily always really know what's going on because we have such a porous border. We hear the number, well, we think there are 11 million illegal immigrants in the country. Nobody really knows because we don't have any way to count or keep track. And that's another thing that frustrates the Republican base. How is it that we can have millions of people in the country, we don't even know who they are, where they are, or how many they are?
It's very unusual because we're at historically low border crossings. I mean, we haven't seen this few number of Mexicans crossing since 1971. I mean, very few Mexicans cross the border legally anymore. But the debate on immigration has this retro feel. My sense is that in some ways, we're talking about demographic change sometimes. We're talking about fears of demographic change. Perhaps we're talking about fears of economic competition in the US, and politicians have played on that, and they've played on the idea that lots of people are coming to this country.
We're seeing more Mexicans leaving the United States and entering, and obviously now we're seeing more Central Americans, particularly from the Northern Triangle, coming in. I think it's difficult for the average American who's not necessarily exposed to the wide variety of individuals coming from Latin America to kind of differentiate, but there's always just kind of been that historical tension because of the proximity of Mexico to the US.
Washington has legitimate concerns that Mexico's vicious drug war and organized crime could spill over the border. There remains the ongoing need for cooperation in fighting drug trafficking and in preventing potential terrorists from using Mexico as a gateway to the U.S.
So we've all watched in recent years as the Mexican drug cartels have gotten more powerful, more dangerous. The Mexican government, I think, is doing an admirable job, or has been at least sincerely trying to get control of these gangs. It is a problem. A lot of drugs come across the border, a lot of illegal guns coming across the border, and we're not sufficiently doing enough to stop it. And I think Donald Trump was right to run on that as an issue.
9/11 changed the way that both Canada and Mexico engage with the United States because we share a common border, land border. It changed the way in which we think of intelligence sharing and law enforcement cooperation and security cooperation. And over the past 20 plus years, these two drivers fundamentally changed the nature of US-Mexican ties.
Today, Mexico is America's third largest trading partner. But the relationship began as a rivalry for land and power on the continent.
You don't have to go that far back in time in Mexican history to find a very cautious and suspicious engagement with the United States. Remember that there's this famous quote that is attributed to a 19th century Mexican president, "Poor Mexico, so far away from God and so close to the United States."
Well, this is one of the few places in the world, perhaps the only one, where an underdeveloped country has a land border 2,000 miles long with one of the world's superpowers. So it's going to be a tense relationship no matter what.
Formerly part of Mexico, Texas was a young independent republic when the U.S. annexed it in 1845, helping spark the Mexican-American War. Upon victory, the U.S. forced Mexico to give up much of what is now California, Arizona, and New Mexico.
The Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848 was an effort by the U.S. administration to seize what turned out to be half of Mexico's national territory. The margin of victory was very tight, but the U.S. was able to win the war.
Relations improved in the 20th century with the U.S. supporting the Mexican Revolution that saw the overthrow of the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz.
The United States, usually as a great power, even by the beginning of the 20th century, found itself on the side of conservatives and the status quo in most parts of the world. But in the case of the Mexican Revolution, the Wilson administration had much greater sympathy for the revolutionaries. At one point, Washington said, let it be known that it was backing Pancho Villa and various other revolutionaries who were attempting to advocate for more democracy and for social justice.
What's interesting from the U.S. side of it, I think, is on one hand, Mexico was, at the time of the revolution, 1910, the major destination for American foreign capital. So that meant that the social revolution affected American interests. The second thing is that the weapons for the revolution were all bought in the U.S.
For the most part, U.S.-Mexican relations have been good since the 1930s, since Franklin Delano Roosevelt's time when he adopted the good neighbor policy. And there have really been very few exceptions to that rule.
A developing closeness between the United States, Canada, and Mexico would serve notice on friend and foe alike that we were prepared for the long haul, looking outward again and confident of our future. That together we're going to create jobs, to generate new fortunes of wealth for many, and provide a legacy for the children of each of our countries.
You, sir, are entitled to our congratulations. I'd also like to welcome here the representatives from Mexico and Canada and tell them they are, in fact, welcome here. They are our partners in the future that we're trying to make together.
The U.S. and Mexico, along with Canada, cemented their friendship in 1994 with the implementation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allows the tariff-free flow of goods between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
I went down as George Herbert Walker Bush's ambassador to Mexico in 1989, and I was there for 4 years. And it was during that time that the NAFTA was both conceived and negotiated. I think the most important point about the NAFTA is that Mexico is a neighbor. We have an undefended 2,000-mile border with it. We're at peace with both Mexico and Canada, and it just makes sense to try to integrate the economic activity of our three countries as much as possible.
The Mexican government decided, I would say, right in the wake of globalization, that it was in the country's best interest to open up its economy to the world. Nowadays, Mexico is probably one of the most open economies in the world.
Both sides had a decision to make. The decision on the U.S. side was much more traditional. Republicans have always been, until recently, in favor of free trade. Mexicans have always been cautious about American interests. But for the U.S., it was a much easier decision.
It was considered both in economic terms and in development terms as a step in order to put Mexico ahead of globalization.
Since then, U.S. trade with Mexico and Canada has tripled, helping the economy grow. American foreign direct investment in Mexico also soared from $17 billion in 1994 to more than $100 billion by 2012.
You know, if you step back and look at what Mexico was doing before NAFTA and what it's doing today, it's a really revealing story. 25 years ago, it was a closed economy, mostly state-owned enterprises, didn't belong to international trade agreements, had a one-party political system. pretty undemocratic, and very little exposure to world trade. Today, it's a vibrant two-party democracy, very open markets, no tariffs on US exports, basically. 20% of Mexico's GDP is imports from the United States. That's how good a trading partner they've become.
If you like to eat steak on a weekend or drink cold beer, you've benefited from lower prices as an American consumer. If you are in San Antonio and have a job because of the Toyota plant, a lot of that is because of the supply chains between the US and Mexico.
Some argue that free trade allows lower-paid foreign workers to undercut the U.S. labor market. Globalization, they say, can damage the U.S. and economically imperil its citizens.
NAFTA was sold to Americans as what was going to be a great boon to both economies. It has done wonderful things for the economy, but it has also been very hard on communities, real towns, real regions, real industries.
I think NAFTA was a big problem, actually, and if you look at the economic analysis, and again, it's not that all trade is bad trade, it's that the ultimate effects of trade have to be very carefully calibrated. And I believe it's possible to craft trade agreements that are good for workers, good for the economy, and really uphold human rights. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case with the trade agreements we've crafted.
No matter the political headwinds, cultural ties between the U.S. and Mexico remain strong, and that's unlikely to change.
I'm in the school that always believed, and I still do, that Mexico is one of the most important bilateral relationships that the United States has, not only because of the trade and the proximity of the two countries, the fact that we have a common border, but also the large Hispanic population, Latino population in the United States, probably 30 or 40 million people of Mexican origin who live in this country and who are becoming a social, cultural, and political force in America in their own right.
We also have around 1.3, 1.5 million Americans living in Mexico. And we do have a history that intertwines. If you visit the border, you will see that people sometimes just cross over to the other side to make grocery. That there are families living on both sides of the border. That there are friendships that living on both sides of the border.
The U.S. and Mexico are more than just neighbors. We are brothers and sisters and husband and wife. The relationship is deep and broad.
Powerful cultural ties are reflected in food and film.
It's now 20 years since salsa became much more popular than ketchup in U.S. supermarkets. And you can tell that 20 or 30 years ago, there were no taco stands. Chipotle was not a word that Americans would recognize.
Mexico is also involved in our daily life in all sorts of things that we don't always notice. 4 of the last 5 directors who win the best Oscar were Mexican, for example. And this is an incredible story, actually, of how Hollywood and the Mexican filmmakers have come together.
The southern border are Mexican. Most migrants come from Central and South America.
The challenge that we now have is particularly Central American, but also South American transmigration through Mexico as a conduit to the United States. A lot of this is still predicated on the basic principles of supply and demand. You've got an economy in the United States, especially in the agricultural sector, that desperately needs labor that it can't find domestically.
Mexicans are still not used to thinking of themselves as a transit country for immigration, but most of the migration flows across the border these days are Central Americans who are coming through Mexico.
We have seen criminal aliens attempt to enter the alien flow to the United States, and this is plainly an issue. MS-13 was designated as a transnational criminal organization by the Obama administration. And intelligence has indicated that MS-13 is attempting to widen its influence in the United States after years of decline.
Despite political tensions, the U.S. and Mexico have increased cooperation on cross-border security issues.
We will deploy over 5,200 soldiers to the southwest border.
Behind the scenes, there's such extensive work being conducted. You know, a positive sign that we've seen from the Mexican side of kind of their continued intent to wanting to cooperate with the United States was them extraditing El Chapo to President Trump. That was a huge deal. They never wanted to give up El Chapo. And he's facing justice inside of a U.S. courtroom.
We have very good customs infrastructure and systems. And we increasingly work with the United States, with the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies to secure the border. On a daily basis between Mexico and the United States, we have agents on both sides working side by side to secure the border. We have increasing intelligence exchange between our governments to secure the border.
Trace agreement allows PGR and ATF to join forces in tracing weapons that are a root of cartel violence in this country.
Washington, meanwhile, has answered one of Mexico's demands with Project Gunrunner, an initiative to crack down on the export of military-grade weapons which are illegal in Mexico, but legal in the U.S.
The problem is that Mexico gets a lot of weapons, automatic weapons, that are illegally, and I emphasize, illegal crossing into Mexico and ending up in the hands of organized crime. And that makes it much more difficult for us to combat organized crime.
Mexico has never attempted to challenge what the Second Amendment says or does. What Mexico has asked of the United States is A, prevent guns from being illicitly sold in the United States to individuals who shouldn't be buying them in the first place, and B, prevent them from illegally being crossed over international border. And as long as that continues to happen, you're going to see up to 60 or 70% of all firearms that are seized in Mexico traced back to a seller or a gun show or a gun shop in the United States.
We will follow three basic principles: to not lie, to not steal, and to not betray the people.
¡Viva México! ¡Viva México!
Crime, violence, and corruption were the dominant issues in Mexico's 2018 presidential election, where Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador triumphed.
Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador is a populist. He's run for the presidency twice before. He's railed against the Mexican economic and political elite for its corruption and is responsible for the country's inequality.
The relationship with the United States did not determine the outcome of the Mexican presidential election. Mexicans went to the polling booths to vote for their candidate based on the issues of corruption, impunity, lack of transparency and accountability, and the very challenging issue of public insecurity.
The past two administrations from different parties have decided to confront very clearly transnational organized crime. And that in some occasions have resulted in very violent responses on the part of organized crime. I believe that the government is addressing, to the best of the ability, this challenge. These are not things that are solved quickly.
Some experts are concerned that America's attitude towards Mexico has opened the door for other nations. China now seeks opportunities in Mexico.
China is competing geopolitically with the United States, and its presence has grown significantly throughout Latin America. There are many good reasons why it makes sense for the United States and Mexico to continue to trade, invest, and do business with one another. Because in many ways, China is more a competing player for Mexico than a complementing one.
Not only China, but Russia as well too. This is the mistake that I think that many in this administration are making, is that we are opening up an opportunity for China to invest, especially when it comes to the energy sector in Mexico.
Observers point out that despite the recent roller coaster of rhetoric, the U.S.-Mexico relationship is thriving. Both governments are quietly demonstrating a willingness to work together on key issues.
The U.S.-Mexico relationship is so much more than just this particular minor spat that's going on, right? On a daily basis, we have U.S. officials from various sectors of the government, whether it's the federal government, even state governments, particularly along the border states, interacting with their Mexican counterparts on a daily basis.
The conversation between the two men at the top does have an impact on the broader relationship, but it's not the only aspect of the bilateral relationship that we should be looking at.
Government officials on both sides of the border have been doing yeoman's work to bulletproof and Teflon coat the day-to-day workings of the diplomatic relationship, to prevent the relationship from spinning off into the unknown, and to try and ensure that we can more or less silo and protect the very complex issues that make up the bilateral relationship today. Very few people, even in Washington, D.C., sometimes appreciate the many moving pieces of what is probably the most complex bilateral relationship that the United States has on the face of the earth.
Whether good fences make for good neighbors is being hotly debated in Washington and Mexico City, but the cultural and economic influence of Mexico on the United States shows no sign of abating.